In the run-up to the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Samoa, the UK has reaffirmed its stance against offering an apology or reparations for its colonial past, particularly regarding its role in the transatlantic slave trade and the colonialisation of Australia. And this position has been reiterated by Sir Keir Starmer, despite calls for greater accountability from Commonwealth nations, notably the Caribbean states, through the CARICOM Reparations Commission. The UK's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade spanned about 300 years, with devastating consequences for millions of Africans forcibly transported to the Americas, beginning with John Hawkins' first slaving expedition in 1562 and later institutionalised through the Royal African Company under King Charles III's ancestor, Charles II, and the slave trade became a cornerstone of British economic expansion, and the wealth generated by slavery enriched British merchants, the Crown, and the wider society, contributing to the infrastructure and the global reach of the empire. British cities like Liverpool and Bristol thrived on profits of human suffering, leaving behind a dark legacy of racial inequality. And although Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807 and led the call for the abolition of slavery, the abolition of slavery itself taking place in 1833, under people like Wilberforce and so on, the aftermath of these actions reveals the moral complexity of the period. And slave owners were compensated for their loss of property with £20 million, a debt only fully paid by British taxpayers in 2015. And while the enslaved received no reparations or formal recognition of their suffering, this remains a point of contention, with advocates like Hilary Beckles of the CARICOM Reparations Commission arguing that the legacy of this exploitation has perpetuated poverty and racial disparities across former colonies. This, I think, is a bigger question than the emancipation of the serfs under Alexander the Second in Russia, but there are comparisons. The UK's refusal to apologise or offer reparations while engaging diplomatically on these issues reflects a broader tension in historical reckoning. An apology, many argue, would acknowledge the suffering caused by Britain's pivotal role in the transatlantic slave trade and its legacy of systemic racism, which continues to shape inequalities today. Such an act would not only be symbolic, but could open the door to more substantive measures of reparative justice. However, critics of reparations argue that current generations should not be held responsible for the actions of their ancestors, and that apologising for historical wrongs does little to address present-day challenges. The debate over Britain's colonial legacy, which also encompasses the colonisation of Australia and the treatment of indigenous peoples, the first peoples in Australia, continues to fuel political and social discussions, especially as countries within the Commonwealth increasingly call for recognition and restitution. As the UK navigates this complex history, therefore, it remains to be seen whether future governments will revisit the question of an apology or reparations, especially in the context of growing global movements that seek to address historical injustice.